Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Monona Terrace for this Wright Design Series event, and thanks for joining us. My name is Rick Chandler. I'm the president of the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation, one of the groups that's worked to put on this presentation tonight. And we're doing it with our partners, Monona Terrace, the American Institute of Architects, Wisconsin, and the Charles Quagliana architecture firm, which specializes in historic preservation projects. I'll say a few words about the Madison Trust for Historic Preservation. For those of you who may not be familiar with our organization, we were founded in 1974 to encourage preservation of historically and architecturally significant buildings in the Madison area. We're proud to be celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Our mission is to encourage historic preservation through education and advocacy. And our motto is that we want to preserve the best of the past as we help shape the future. We want to preserve the buildings, neighborhoods, streetscapes, and landscapes that give Madison its distinct design character and identity. We know that Madison is growing, we support development, and we believe development can take place in a way that maintains the places that residents love, such as the historic buildings and unique stores on State Street and our historic walkable neighborhoods. We conduct walking tours and hold various events to help people learn about Madison's history, and we engage in advocacy about historic preservation issues. Our approach to preservation is inclusive. Our tours and advocacy efforts include working class neighborhoods, historically underrepresented communities, vernacular homes, commercial districts, not just mansions and important civic structures, although we have tours that cover those as well. So all of that, I think, leads into the topic for tonight's presentation. And I'd now like to introduce tonight's speaker, Paul Bauknight, who will be speaking about place, urbanism, and spatial justice. Mr. Bauknight is an architect, urban designer, design activist, and community leader based in the Twin Cities. He is the founder and president of the Center for Transformative Urban Design, an interdisciplinary design justice studio dedicated to inclusive and equitable development of cities, neighborhoods, and towns through knowledge building, policy change, diversification of design professionals, and real estate development. He will discuss the concept and application of spatial justice for communities. His presentation is titled Place, Urbanism, and Spatial Justice. And after his presentation, he'll be available for questions and answers from the audience. We're glad to be able to host him in Madison. We're glad we have great weather for his visit. It's pretty much like this, 11 months a year in Madison. So very good to have him with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Paul Bauknight.
Good evening, everybody. Okay, we're going to do that again. We're going to do that again. Anybody who knows me knows I do this every time. It's like kind of allows you to like make the room yours and do a little call and response. So good evening, everybody. All right, all right. So again, yeah, my name is Paul Bauknight, and I want to thank the Madison Historic Trust, Monona Terrace, the AIA Wisconsin, and Charles Quagliana for inviting me here tonight. I'm looking forward to having a good time with you guys and talking a little bit about spatial justice, something that I'm very passionate about. And yeah, if it's like this 11 months out of the year in Madison, I'll ask my wife, could we move? All right, so place, urbanism, and spatial justice, the relationship between justice and physical development. Before we get into that, okay, there we go. Before we get into that, I think it's always good for people to get a little bit to know about who you are, not just your bio, about your, what you've done. It's a little bit more about what's your story, how did you get here, right? I didn't, start out creating the Center for Transformative Urban Design, last week. So there's a little bit of a lived experience here. So welcome to Cranford. That's where I grew up in New Jersey. A little shout out to the family on Zoom. But I grew up in Cranford, New Jersey. My mother was born there, and it's a town not that far from Newark, but a small town, 27,000 people, community-based town. We were a family that was well connected, that was part of community, well connected, and spent our time, doing the 4 Fs: faith, family, fun, and food. That's how we grew up. That's what we did. So that's where I grew up at Cranford. The history of growing up in the 60s and 70s. This is a picture of the riots in Newark. My mother worked for Prudential, but my father used to talk all about going to Newark all the time to see shows, doing all these things. And this is an example of what happens when people take out their frustrations on space, right? And what happens when, property as a sign of power gets attacked, and then what happens after that, and how long it takes in places to recover from these things, which has a lot to do with justice, urbanism, policy, and a lot of other things that we'll talk about as we go along. I was 7 years old when Martin Luther King was assassinated, so these are parts of my childhood. And I am the young, gifted, and Black generation. This is the song that my dad was an Aretha Franklin freak, and we played this at home all the time. But there's this idea of we were this generation that was had all these advantages, was going to make all this change, and it was what drove us. The older I get, the more I see that my parents really were activists. In terms of what they did, what their connections were, how they operated, how they raised me and my 3 sisters, and what we did in the community. This is a photo of a mural welcoming you to North Minneapolis. North Minneapolis, is where I live, where I've worked for 30 plus years. It's my community. It's done by Charles Caldwell. And it's all about how are you connected to community? How are you going to be a part of it? How do you every day go about, trying to make a difference just by the work that you do, whatever that is, right? And so community is really important to me. North Minneapolis is the traditional African-American community. So we have all of the challenges of African-American communities in cities across the country, right? But it's a wonderful place. All of you who work in community development know how challenging that can be, and how some days you're like, could we just go somewhere which maybe was a little less challenging, right? Right. My wife and I, she works in community development. We have that conversation all the time, and then we just say, oh, well, but this is what we do. We're gluttons for punishment. Okay. So the Center for Transformative Urban Design, that is the organization that I run right now. But it's really the evolution of my career, from architecture school at Virginia Tech. Shout out to the Hokie Nation, where I was also a history minor. So this idea of social studies, culture, history, and the built environment is something that I've always been passionate about. And the center is really how the evolution of my thinking. So to get to the center, I had to get to understanding that to improve the quality of life for my community, I needed to go beyond the design of buildings, right? And I needed to be able to use my design skills to redesign the social, cultural, political, economic, and physical ecosystems that buildings exist in, right? Buildings don't grow out of the ground, right? We have to create them. We create our built environment, and it's impacted by all of the systems that the built environment exists in, right? And so in order to really make change, for me, I need to be like, okay, I need to be able to influence these other pieces. I need to understand these other things, or else we're just making things, right? And then we're wondering, well, why didn't that work? Why didn't that change? Right. So we have the edifice, but things don't change. So our mission um, is all about empowering, changing unjust systems, and really giving agency to people. One of my favorite quotes from a book. I'm really wonky. I love books, so I'll probably quote a bunch of books during the talk. So just to warn you, is from Jason Colburn's Cities for Life. And it says, improving the built environment doesn't necessarily improve relations between neighbors or between communities and dehumanizing institutions. So if you're working on improving the built environment, you got to think about these relationships, and you got to go beyond just what the building is, right? So our vision, is all about, how neighborhoods in the public realm are welcoming, inclusive, and equitable for all. And I think that equitable for all piece is really critical, right? Because we have a lot of, shall we say, conflict around equity. All right. And I love the policy link definition of equity, which talks about equity is about everyone being the best they can be. And by being the best they can be, we all can contribute to community and make it better for everybody. So when we talk about it, it's about all. And what do you need to be the best person you can be, which may be different than what I need to be the best person I can be. But if everybody and all of our systems are working on, okay, how does everybody get to be the best they can be? Right, we'd have a much better world that we would live in, right? So when I talk about equity, that's where I want to get to, like, okay, whether you're the single mom, whether you're the little kid, whether you're the family, whoever you are, whatever is going on, how do you get what you need to be the best person you could be? So, and we talked a little about, but our theory of change is about how do we build knowledge in community, right? And community is large, so it's not only being able to go in a neighborhood and get people to understand what zoning's about, what does area median income mean, what's a small area plan, what are all these words that we tend to throw around, but it's also doing a lot of work with designers to get them to understand things like spatial justice and culture and politics, particularly pushing designers to not be so afraid of being political or taking power, and understanding that, yes, you do have power and you don't have to wait for the project to have power. Diversifying the professions that do the work, yeah. Have all the different lived experiences in the room so we can get the best solutions to the challenges, right? We all talk about how creativity, is the answer, right? So the more different people you have in the room thinking differently, approaching this differently, the more creative is going to be, the better solution you're going to get. And right, can we think, when we can, how real estate can be not just a wealth extractive process, right? So what does that look like? Okay, so how do we do this? We have this tool called the Design Justice Studio, right? It's the heart of the center. You know, it's an interdisciplinary tool, but it's our space, it's our place, right? It's how we achieve our mission and vision. It's anchored by joy, it's inspirational, it's a knowledge exchange, it's a connector. We strategize, we reflect in there, right? And it's where we think about this work. It's trying to build a community of practice around how we do this and keep people engaged, everybody from community members to professionals to artists, like all those people. How do we keep how we keep them engaged? And so the Design Justice Studio is the model that we use, and you can see, right, we've got the kind of the inputs and outputs, or is that, we don't use those terms? Do we still use those terms in nonprofits now, or are we going to something else? We got, we have the impacts of, political, cultural, right? And we have this outreach, right? And yeah, some days those are going to be in tension, and that's okay, because if you don't have any tension, like, you're not doing anything, right? So we could have tension. I know I'm in Minneapolis. We don't like tension. Sometimes we want to be kumbaya, right? But you gotta, it's okay to have tension, right? It's good for relationships to have some tension, right? So that's how we work. So then you get to the next question, like, well, what's this urban? Why are we going to talk about urbanism? Like, so like, why cities? Why are we going to do that, right? Well, cities are the cultural, political, and economic engines of the world, right? And look where we are, right? We're in your beautiful city. And I love cities. I'm not gonna lie, I love cities. And cities are one of humankind's greatest inventions by bringing together people, place, you know, um, work, blah blah blah. Right? We've been able to do all kinds of things. And if we look at where we're going as far as world as cities, like currently 55% of the world's populations live in cities, right? That's expected to rise to 80% by 2050. So just by sheer numbers, you can't ignore cities. Like you have to. Um, Cities are responsible for 80% of the global GDP. So we want to talk about the economy. GDP isn't always the best way to measure economy, but it's the one we use a lot. Right here in the United States, metropolitan areas count for approximately 90% of the US economic output, right? So cities are these great centers of art, humanity, prosperity, right? But they're also the centers of poverty, racism, and injustice, right? So both those things are going on at the same time. But the scale of urbanism means that if we can like solve those disparities at that scale, we're making global impact because we're impacting so many people. And an example of the impact that we can have if we're thinking about cities is that only 2% of the world's surface, land surface, cities occupy. But activities within their borders consume over 75% of the planet's resources, right? So think about that. 2% of the land of the whole world are urban, but we're consuming 75% of the resources. So if we want to solve, the existential threat that climate change is, right, you have to focus on urban areas because they are driving what goes on. So we have to do that. We have to think about cities as places, yes, of innovation, but also places of hope, right? Places of connection, places that are equitable, right? Places where people can come, have a good life, make change, like all that, right? And then we also have to work on all of the things that happen in cities that sometimes aren't so good. All right. So now we're going to get to this connection. Like we're going to go to spatial justice. So why I want to talk about spatial justice? Because everything happens in space. Everything. We're in a space right now. You walk in space. We are spatial beings. So everything happens in space. So justice, injustice, it's all a spatial thing, right? So if we can link things spatially, we can start to get to how these things are connected in the work that we do. So just a couple quick definitions. This is from Edward Soja, who wrote the great book, Spatial Justice. And this definition is about the fair and equitable distribution in space of socially valued resources. And I think for me, this is an incredible one, the opportunity to use them. So you could distribute them, but if everybody doesn't have the opportunity to use them, we have a problem. And we know right now, we have lots of stuff in space that everybody doesn't have the opportunity to use, right? And then this one comes from the Design Studio for Social Intervention, which is in Boston. This guy named Kenny Bailey runs it. It's really great. He's got a great book, Arrangements and Effects. You should check that out. So this one comes from Lefebvre, and it talks about the intersection of space and social justice, right? Because human societies organize space, which is what we do. We organize space. We were just up on the roof. We looked out at the waterfront. We looked at everybody, like we organize space. And then how we organize space, we can see how justice and injustice play out in the visible and invisible, because we know we can go somewhere and we're like, why is this like this? Or why didn't this happen? Right? There are invisible structural arrangements of space, right? So this is all about we as human beings organize space. And it's also about power. Who has the power and the agency to organize space? Who gets to do that? And that's not always equitable in how space gets arranged, right? And the other one that I like that's not up here that Soja talks about is space is socially created. So therefore, for all of us activists and community developers, space can be socially changed, right? So the reason the construction shows up or the bulldozer shows up or whatever is not, they don't show up on their own. People are making that happen for right or wrong, right? So what we're gonna do tonight, after that long introduction, some of you are out there and my wife says, I can talk a lot, is we're gonna talk about where's this intersection of space and justice. How do we get to points where, like, yes, your zip code tells you what your life expectancy is going to be? So how is that geography, a space? How do we get there? And how is it played out? Really looking at urbanism, like how is human society organized land and human settlements, and how justice and injustice, is playing out. And so we're going to do a little bit of a history lesson about land and injustice. We're going to focus on the United States now. My sister is a history teacher in high school in New Jersey. So I'm hoping I got all my facts right. She may be fact checking me live here while I'm talking. But we're going to start talking about like how we've seen land in the United States and its impacts, right? So if we're going to talk about that, we have to start here. We cannot talk about land in the United States without talking about slavery, and without talking about taking the land from the native people. So the whole idea of, yes, land is something we monetize is the reality of pushing where we're at and how we got here, right? So we all know this story. We all know that colonizers stole the land from indigenous people. They enslaved African people to work the land to create the greatest economy the world's ever known. And that is a spatial organization. That is a spatial organization, right? When we think about cities, why do we have grids? Because now we can quantify where the land is, right? And that's how the United States has thought about land is essential to the success of the country and how we see ourselves, the ongoing battles in neighborhoods between homeowners and renters. And well, for some reason, your brain gets wacky when you're a renter and you just don't want to take care of stuff because you're a renter. But if you buy something, you are great. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how systems have changed land and injustice. So this is about the Homestead Act of 1862, right? So the Homestead Act of 1862 is like one of the most revolutionary concepts for the distribution of land in American history, right? So over 270 acres of public, which I think is interesting because it was actually land that was owned mostly by Native Americans, but of public land, or 10% of the area of the United States was transferred to private individuals. So that's a huge thing. That's huge, right? And how it worked is like for an $18 filing fee, which probably was a lot of money in 1862, you got 160 acres. And you had to build a house and farm it, and all of the like areas we're talking about, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, and so like these are all impacted by the Homestead Act. We know that the Homestead Act was not fair and equitable because African Americans were pretty much denied opportunity to get this land, right? And even in 1862, obviously having land was a critical part of surviving and thriving in the United States of America. By 1876, only 6,000 African Americans had actually successfully completed a claim, which is a really bad number since there were 4 million freed slaves at that time, right? So the impact of the Homestead Act is like incredible, and there's some research done that said that in 2000, a quarter of the United States population aged like 25 and up had ancestors that benefited from the Homestead Act, right? So some of you in this room, somewhere in your genealogy, have benefited from the Homestead Act. And land has always been a wealth builder. This whole ability to create generational wealth from land, the government aiding, and not being democratic about it, is part of our history. and is a spatial injustice. So we leave the is that right? Yeah, okay. I don't know how we got to that, but we're gonna roll with that. We're gonna roll with that because there's something that's off in that slide. But that's okay. So we're gonna talk about the Great Migration. So we all know about the Great Migration, which is this huge influx of Black people from the rural South. And, it is really precipitated by the fact that after William Sherman's field order, ordered the redistribution, field order number 15, ordered the redistribution of 400 acres of formerly Confederate-owned lands to the newly freed slaves, the 40 acres and a mule. And actually, at first, it was only 40 acres. Then people came back and said, can we have a mule too? Right? Is an example of now land being used for a justice, saying, yes, we're going to take this land that formerly enslaved peoples worked to make money for white planters. We're going to give it to them so that they now can thrive and survive, right? So this was this idea, right, by the government, okay? President Lincoln gets assassinated. President Andrew Johnson says, nope, I'm going to give the land back to the former Confederates. And that sets up Jim Crow, terrorism of African Americans in the South. And that history leads to the Great Migration, right? And that is one of the greatest spatial transformations in our country's history, right? The blues in Chicago is about people coming from Mississippi going there, right? So in a period of roughly 60 years, more than 6 million Black Americans left the rural South and relocated to cities in the North, Midwest, and the West, obviously trying to get away from racism and Jim Crow. In the South, they went to the North and found out, like, well, racism isn't as bad in the North and the South, but it's not exactly what people told us. But what's the big impact here? The big change in population, right? So major cities, Black populations, like boom, overnight. So places like New York increased by 66%, Chicago by 148%, Philadelphia by 500%, Detroit by 611%. So you have this huge influx of Black people coming to these cities, right? Segregation was still the rule of the day. And that created this whole spatiality of, like, where do you live, right? So we have intense crowding because you can only live in certain neighborhoods. We have all of the types of real estate where you're like, yeah, you can buy this house on contract. People like dividing up tenements into like incredible number of rooms to fit more and more people in to rent, right? And so we have the beginnings, of overcrowded, predominantly Black, poor neighborhoods that, continues and continues. So basically, all these folks came for a better life, just like immigrants have been doing forever to the United States, came for a better life to the North and really transformed these cities culturally, spatially, right? And so then what happened is that, racially based housing ordinances were deemed unconstitutional in 1917, right? So this really leads to the creation and implementation of racial covenants in housing, right? So we all know there's a strategy where, like, you get on your deed, it said this house couldn't be sold to Black people, Jewish people, and they had a bunch of other people, right? This is like, okay, we're going to keep this housing pure and whites. And that remained legal until 1948, which is not that long ago. So a lot of times we think about all something like, oh, it's a long time ago. No, 1948. It's not a long time ago. So this is, that impact, of housing discrimination and injustice on individuals, we're still dealing with today. So then, in order to make sure that we keep people where they're supposed to be and we don't invest there, right? We don't use capitalism. No, there's redlining. Because in 1933, the United States was facing a housing shortage, big housing shortage. And the federal government is like, we have to do something about this. We have to deal with this housing shortage. So the federal government got into housing, and it decided that it was going to make it easier for people to buy a house by insuring mortgages, so that if you didn't pay the federal government. Before that, it was really hard to get a mortgage. They were very short, and there would be a big balloon at the end. So the federal government gets in here, creates this 30-year amortized mortgage, says, yep, we're going to back this. So, now all of a sudden it's way easier for people to buy a house, right? But who could buy a house is the key question in that. Now, this is the federal government, right? We're all paying taxes to the same government, right? But part of the policy of the federal government was that we are not going to invest in neighborhoods where people of color live. They made these maps, green being the best. This is a redlining map of Madison, green being the best, red being the worst. Red always was in the Black neighborhoods, right? So hence the term redlining, right? So you can go across the country, you can look at redlining maps pretty much anywhere and look at those neighborhoods now. And most of the time, those neighborhoods are still struggling from redlining, because it was a policy saying we are not going to put money in your community, right? We're telling everybody, nope, this is a bad place. We're not going to do it. It's too risky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this spatial strategy, this is a map, right? These are spaces. This spatial strategy of investing only in white communities and disinvesting in Black communities, it's clearly a spatial injustice that we're still dealing with today. And what is this redlining going to set up? First of all, it creates, by redlining and by insuring mortgages, what do? First, we create the middle class. Right? Like the government engineers the middle class by saying, yes, we're going to insure your mortgage and you can go out and buy a house, and that can be your wealth builder, and you can pass that down to your children. So we're creating the middle class in America through a space, through using a house, right? And at the same time, we are defining spatial patterns of discrimination and exclusion in cities and suburbs that are with us to today, right? So then we get this, right? Segregation, suburbanation, right? Levittown, any of these, we think about the dawn of suburban, any of those developments could not have been done without the government saying to the developers, yes, we're going to insure these loans that you're going to get. And so you can build these houses. And if someone defaults, it's not on you. So now we're able to create these developments, because Levittown, is out in a potato field, right? So we're able to go out here, we're able to create these developments with the federal government's help, and they're all white, right? We're not allowing people of color to buy a house here, even though the government is supporting this. And we're creating places that are absolutely segregated and racist. And we all have heard the stories about Black people trying to buy the houses by getting a white person to go and buy the house, and then what happens after that. So we're continuing to say spatially only certain people should be able to do this and should be able to thrive, because we're using how we create space, how we make it, who gets to use it, the systems we use to finance it, to exclude people, to create injustice, right? So that whole thing in the beginning about, right, we organize, our societies organize, right? This is about how we organize this and who has the power to organize this or not organize it and make it happen or not make it happen, right? So we're continuing to build the middle class, we're continuing to create houses, the whole small house, white picket fence, like all of that, yeah, this is where this comes from. And it's all about our economy, right? Because those of you who own a house know, right? If you own a house, you got to wash, you got to buy a washer, you got to buy a dryer, you got to buy a lawnmower, right? Like all of the stuff that goes with owning a house is part of the economy. And all of this is also about the car, right? And our beloved love affair, which we still have, with cars. And now we all, we're talking about the 15-minute city and all that, but that's not new. It's not new. Like, that's what it used to be. You lived here, you could walk to the store, you could walk to school, you could walk to right, and then we went to this. It was better, and you could get out there. So here is, segregation and suburbanization, and we know that we still, when we look at our cities and we look at spaces around them, we look at the suburbs, we know we're still struggling with this, right? This didn't go away, right? Particularly because by the time other people got a chance to get here, right, you're way ahead. All right. So what is that drive? What's happening next, right? So now we've had all this, great, let's get everybody to leave the city, right? And so cities are struggling, right? In the 1950s and 60s, cities are struggling, right? There's pressure on cities due to suburbanization, due to economic pressures, crime, blah, 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 social distress. Cities are struggling. So we have another big thing, urban renewal. What's urban renewal? We're going to come in and we're going to pick these large swaths of land. We're going to bulldoze whatever was there. And we're going to turn it into great projects, right? Now, usually the great swaths of land are where poor people and people of color lived, coincidentally, right? So we're going to tear these down. We're going to build these great things, which are, all for the common. It's all for the common good. It's great, right? The James Baldwin quote that he came up with, urban renewal is Negro removal, but he's protesting what's going on in New York City. These are maps from Minneapolis about their urban renewal. And what's kind of quiet is that Minneapolis had one of the biggest urban renewal schemes in the country. They demolished over 7,000 homes and displaced almost 23,000 people. And these are a series of maps kind of showing that development. North Minneapolis is up in the left-hand corner. That's North Minneapolis. And so the spatial inequality of this approach is really interesting, because when this is going on in the 1960s, the non-white population of Minneapolis was 3%. 3%. But 35% of the people displaced in urban renewal were people of color. So you have to be intentional. You have to be intentional to get like, yeah, there's only 3% non-white people, but we're going to displace 35% of them, right? So, urban renewal, segregation, all of that gets us to civil unrest, right? So housing was a big part of the civil rights movement. As we just seen, Black people were still limited on where they could live, could they buy, quality of housing, all those things, right? And that's all about systemic and institutional racism. So the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1968, still not that long ago, right? And that begins like the long struggle to end discrimination in housing, which we're still dealing with, right? And there's been discussion about, well, do we need the Fair Housing Act anymore? All right. So we got the combination of economic pressures. We got a recession in 68. We got the Vietnam War. We got police brutality. The assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X, like 3 years before King, right? We have all this pent up frustration that's happening in cities. And there's also a lot of frustration too about the glacial pace of civil rights, right? We got the conflict of the traditional civil rights, Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael, like all of that going on, right? After a while, people can only be frustrated and hemmed in for a while, and something's gonna make that erupt. So we get civil unrest, and we get all of this going on in major cities across the country, right? Newark, Detroit, Chicago, LA. We get that, right? And what I find interesting, and as I've spent more time in spatial justice, people always say, why do people burn down property when we have this? And I think it's about power. It's just like, okay, we're going to show you that because a lot of the stuff they're burning down, they don't own. we're going to show you that we have the ability to attack something, that's important to you. So it's like a spatial response to a spatial injustice by doing this. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times what happens in the aftermath of this is that creates even more disinvestment, more hollowing out, and we struggle. So I had that slide in the beginning about Newark, and it took till not that long ago for the third ward, which is where the riots were, to really recover, right? So it's like these things take, decades. But what this drives is neighborhoods then are even, more limited. They're more disinvested. They lose amenities, programs, education, job, like all that happens. And who's left is usually mostly the poor and BIPOC people left behind. Now, usually what we do is we come back in here and we talk about what should we build next, right? Right? And in Minneapolis, they had the unrest. Had a lot of talk about, well, we're gonna do housing, we're gonna do entrepreneurship, right? And I'm like, because I'm a history buff. I'm like, that's what we do every time we have unrest. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. So we need to focus more on how we build people, right? How do we make people successful as opposed to how we get to the buildings? Now, we do need to do the rebuilding, but the building isn't the answer. It's what holds what you need to do in it, right? So if we talk Andre Perry's book, right? Build people, not buildings. So unrest actually, unfortunately, continues to happen. Let me get better at that. So we're continuing with this housing inequality, which even accelerates, as I said about civil unrest. Here's some photos from at Chicago, right? We got public housing, which continues to deteriorate, and people see it as a blight, right? And most of that is because of a lot, it's not a blight, but people living there are suffering from poor health, poor schools, poor jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And how these complexes were run then and were really bad. Great book, The High Risers, which is the history of Chicago and Cabrini Green, is a really great book that really gets into this, right? And we know that sort of the height of how affordable housing and public housing has failed is the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe, right? Which everyone blames actually on the people who lived in Pruitt-Igoe or the buildings, but actually it's the ecosystem that's around that didn't provide what was needed for that to be successful. So what we see is these spatial arrangements that are seen and unseen here are why this didn't work, right? And it's really dark days for cities in the 70s, right? They're bad. New York is going bankrupt, right? Like everyone's like, yeah, I want to get out. So people are leaving cities except for people who can't leave the cities. So, we have that hollowing out of cities, right? That donut effect, right? Where, people in the center, mostly Black and brown people in the center, and everybody around was white, and people keep leaving, right? So we had that, and we had this hollowing out, and, it was really bad. And then we had this rebirth. So the one picture up there is Jimmy Carter. That's in the South Bronx, right? And, the South Bronx was one of the poster children for how bad cities were. We had that movie Fort Apache, the Bronx, right? The picture below that is what the South Bronx is like now, right? The point though here is that the people who were suffering in the top picture are not living in those gleaming high rises down there. And the idea that the way at times, what's great about that changes that look shiny, it's nice, we can all go there, it's great, but it's still about how we monetize land for profit. And we're not thinking about who the people that got displaced or got left out or weren't helped when nobody thought that land was valuable, right? But then it became valuable all of a sudden, and now it's like, great, right? So, if you drive from here to Chicago and you used to, you saw all the high rises, right on the edge of downtown, right? You would drive through, right? They're all gone, right? They've been redeveloped, mixed use, mixed income. We can have a deeper discussion about whether that works or not. Um, but I think the real challenge here is when we're talking about rethinking these, is like really thinking about who is there now, how are they not displaced, um, and is something like this better for them, right? Because yeah, and Brooklyn is another one. Like, yeah, right. But how do we make sure that people who are in that neighborhood, who have been there, can stay, right? And how do we think about what we make spatially, um, that does make sure that they're okay and take them into consideration? And it's not just, yes, it's great because we were able to do that and make money, right? Right. So how do we balance those? And anytime we do that, housing prices go up, and people get impacted by no fault of their own, right? And so, yeah, if you can afford to live there, it's all great. But if you're getting impacted by that, like the High Line, right, which they didn't think that, yeah, this is going to jack up all the prices all around the High Line. They just thought, yeah, this is going to be great. You walk down the High Line now, what? It's all luxury on all sides, and the neighborhood was displaced. They've come to figure out, like, yes, we should have thought about that before, but they didn't, right? So this is also all about, the fire economy, right? And what's the fire economy? Finance, insurance, and real estate, which is the biggest contributor to the economy in the United States, right? And the goal of that economy is to make money, right? And more development isn't better development, and more development isn't always what we need, right? But if we're going to think about development, we have to really think about it from a spatially just way, and all the things that I talked about we need to do. So through all of this, like, what are the impacts? How do we think about impacts? And there's just a couple of things that we're still dealing with because of this history that we just talked about, right? Home ownership rate by race. We are still struggling to get Black people of color, to have the same kind of home ownership rate as white people. And yes, owning a home is still the most way that people generate wealth in the United States for your family, right? We're not over that. Housing is not a right in the United States, and as long as it's a wealth builder, we're going to have this, which is why I talk to people in community all the time, and particularly Black and brown people, and go, yes, I want you to get more money so you can buy a house conventionally like other people do, right? Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about, I want you to get more money so you can invest in the stock market, because that's even better. The income gap and the wealth gap. I mean, it speaks for itself. And this is historical, right? And it's because of all the things we talked about, of what you didn't get and why you're still stuck here, and about systemic and institutional racism. And it results in, what you can and can't do, spaces, build a creative business, talk about whatever you want. This one was really interesting, struck me. Because we talk about health and we talk about the social determinants of health, we know that going to the doctor is the smallest portion of what makes you healthy. It's your education, it's where you live, it's your access to green space, it's your social network. Like, all of those things is really what makes you healthy, right? And the more of those things you have, maybe you go to the doctor every 6 months. This is a chart from 2020 that talks about how Black males have lost 3 years of life in 6 months. And that's about trauma. That's what that's about. That's about the trauma. All right. So these are things that are tied together. And as we think about how we're arranging space in our cities and what we're going to do, we have to make these connections. And we can talk about all this within space. So you can go to, as we were talking about, the people who work on the sidewalks, and say, yeah, you're operating in space. So we're all connected, right? You go to your parks, you can go to your schools, right? And I know it's hard. I'm not going to say, it's kumbaya and it's so easy to get all these different systems and institutions in a room and start thinking about long term. But that's the only way it's going to work, because we can't work separately, because we're all connected. And I guess we haven't learned, because, the pandemic showed that we are all connected. What happens on the other side of the world impacts us, right? We are all connected more and more, particularly in. So I didn't want to go through this whole thing and be like, oh, doom and gloom. And, oh my God, Paul, like, is anyone doing anything? I'm gonna have to go home and have a drink after this because it was depressing. So I want to talk a little bit about thriving, not just surviving. This is a couple quick projects, things that are going on that I think are exciting and that show that, yes, you can do this work in a different way. And so there's a list of them. I don't have a whole bunch of slides there because I know we got to get going. The Mariposa Housing Project in Denver, which was completed in like 2017. I think that is a photo of it. So like a lot of places, this was a redevelopment of the South Lincoln Homes, which was built in the 50s, which was failing, was socially isolated, like all the things that we come to think about public housing projects, right? I don't need to tell you that. What was really unique about this project was the idea, like, okay, we're going to take a social determinants of health strategy for what we do here. So understanding what was really going on with the health and safety of the residents here. Like 50% of the children were living in poverty. I think it's 70% of the population had high blood pressure, right? So, they weren't eating well, like all this. So how do we think about creating programs and structures and amenities to get to that, along with how we create housing, right? Because we could easily just do housing, right? We could easily just do housing. And yes, you need to have a clean, safe place, have a roof over your head. But if you're still in poverty, you got way high blood pressure, you're eating bad, you don't feel safe, right? It's not exactly a happy home. So it's like you're at the minimum now. So what's great about that is that they did this health impact assessment. They thought about this. They're doing gardening. And they have a gym for working out. It's programmed. They have job training. Like, they're doing all that within that and making connections to the other programs, along with transit-oriented redevelopment, right? So it's like a way to think spatially about a place from a health basis, which is why I like it. The next one is the Inclusive Capital Collective. I love this one because it's about commercial real estate, right? Any of you who work in community development know that we have a system to do affordable housing. We have low-income housing tax credits, right? And I'm not saying it's easy to navigate LIHTC, but it is a system that exists, right? There are no low-income commercial tax credits out there. It's really hard to do commercial development in communities that are struggling, right? This is about building that. So in 2022, only 3% of Black households own commercial real estate, compared to 8% of white households. Why is that important? Because in 2020, commercial real estate generated $512 billion, with a B, billion dollars, right? So we talk about wealth generation, we talk about prosperity, right? Being able to be part of commercial real estate is a way to build wealth, right? So the Inclusive Capital Collective, or ICC, is all about bringing entrepreneurs and other systems players together to think about how do we democratize capital. Because one of the biggest struggles with doing commercial real estate, particularly for people of color, is getting capital. How do we do that so more people can own commercial real estate, invest in commercial real estate, and be able to build some wealth, right? Which is a different path from homeownership, but you can build wealth in commercial real estate and then, buy a really nice home. Neighborhood investment company, right? So I love these strategies that use our tools that we already have. We're not reinventing. Yeah, you have to have capital, and we're going to buy a building, and you're going to invest in it, and the land and it's going to appreciate, and you're going to get money. So we're saying, hey, we're going to take this system, and we're just going to use it differently, but we're not going to change the system, right? So I don't got to go out there and try to convince, bankers and all these people, like, yeah, you have to like operate like 100% different, because they're like, I can't, for so many reasons, right? So ICC is one. This other one, the Neighborhood Investment Trust, the Neighborhood Investment Company, right? Nope, Neighborhood Investment Company. Sorry, NICO. NICO's in Los Angeles in Echo Park. NICO is a neighborhood REIT, real estate investment trust, right? Real estate investment trust is a tool that's been around for a very long time. People use it all the time. What a REIT does is it buys property, it holds it, you invest in it, you get a dividend, right? That's the basics, right? So NICO's job is to localize how wealth is created and broaden access to neighborhood equity, because who owns property in the neighborhood and how they use it is really important, right? So it's very simple. NICO is buying buildings in the Echo Park neighborhood. It allows residents to invest and from a very low threshold, as little as $100, right? Right? Property appreciates, whatever, you get money back. It also is a hedge on gentrification, because as ownership from a equitable spatial justice lens, we're not going to go like, yeah, the thing we want to do is sell this to the highest bidder so they can create whatever they want in it, right, to make more money. So it's all about getting connected to your community, having ownership, having power, having agency about what goes on, and benefiting from the mechanisms that create wealth in America, right? And then the last one, and this is where I was getting tongue-tied, is the Community Investment Trust. That's in Portland, Oregon. Similar to NICO, right? But the difference is the trust is acquiring commercial properties. They see this as a poverty reduction strategy through collective ownership of real estate assets in residents' community. So they're buying a commercial property. You can invest in it again, right? The max is $100. The smallest is $10 a month. But their goal is, after 3 years, the investors will own the commercial property. So it's a flip where, okay, now you're actually, as neighborhood residents, owning this property, right? Now, it's obviously started out where there's capital for the trust to go out and buy the properties. But what I really like about this is that it really instills this huge sense of pride and strength that you can, in your neighborhood, you're walking down the commercial strip and you're like, yep, we own that, right? And I'm an investor and I'm an owner of part of that property, right? And so it builds on Linear Richardson's Buy Back the Block, that work that he's been doing in Chicago and other places, right? And it's really about shared ownership. So it's like building on the co-op model, but you actually, really own this and you're really going to get money. Okay, so we're almost done. The last thing is just want to talk briefly about some work I'm doing in Spokane, Washington. This is actually, we haven't started yet, but I'm really excited about this. Fifth Avenue Community Plan in Spokane. We just were awarded this project with a group of firms out of, they're all in Seattle. And this is all about redeveloping the Fifth Avenue Commercial District, which is in the East Side Central neighborhood in Spokane. Historically Black community. Unfortunately, it's seen all the spatial injustice, been disinvested, it's been redlined. I-90, the interstate has gone through it. So like we have all of that that's gone on. The city and the neighborhood are going to work together in this really co-creative, co-development process to figure out how the commercial corridor and how that extends is going to be a mechanism to do all the things that we talk about. Where I'm at in this is we're going to use the Design Justice Studio as the mechanism to build relationships, bring the community together, build this community of practice. We're going to situate it in a yet to be named community partner. We haven't figured that out yet because we're waiting for this city to get us our contract. But that's going to be the mechanism, right? To really get how do we work together? And, you know, it's really hard to build relationships between community and city. And at times it's really hard to build relationships inside community, right? We work in community development. We know that sometimes people don't get along for whatever reason. And so during the interview, one of the things that I stress is that this is not just a, hey, city thing. This is how we're going to get community to participate and to deal with some of their own struggles. Yes, it's a traditional Black neighborhood, but it's also, there are other ethnic minorities in it now. And so we already have some of these struggles of, we were here before you, right? I mean, we've got some of that playing out already. And so how do we work that out? But the goal here is to really break down those hierarchies. I was really honest with the city. Are you going to be willing to give up power? Because you cannot co-create if you don't want to give up power. If you're not willing to give up any power, we're not going to get there. Now they said yes. We'll see. I don't know yet, but we're going to have the Design Justice Studio on the ground. We're also going to work with young people, which is the other passion of mine. They are the stewards of these communities, and they're the ones who will tell you straight what the heck is going on, out there. And we're going to see how we could do this. This is long term. So we want to use the process to figure out the plan, and we want to use the process to implement the plan. And I think that is it. I want to thank you again for listening to me, and I am happy to take questions. Oh, wait, I forgot two things. Before I finish, I have to talk about two special people in my life. First one is my daughter, Nicole, because if you've seen any PowerPoint of mine, she is the design and technical director, which this is nice to say that dad sucks at PowerPoint. That's the truth. And then my wife, Patricia, who continues to inspire me by her own community development work. And finishing up with this slide, like, this is what we got to remember, right? How do people give up power? Because they think they don't have any. We all have power. How we choose to use it is really important, right? But we all have power, and we all have to exercise it. And we all can make a difference in small ways. You don't have to do a big thing. You don't have to start a nonprofit like me. But we can all make a difference if we think about how we want to use our power to make this work. It's from the Black Space Manifesto, how we need to reckon with the past to build the future. So we need to understand what's happened, where the injustices have been, who's done what in order to get there, right? That's my email. Happy to talk to anybody. If you want to get a hold of me, please use my email, right? If you send me LinkedIn stuff, I look at it sometime, and guy who does my communications is hating me right now. But if you really want to talk to me, please send me an email, right? Or call me on the phone, as Charles knows. If you call me on the phone, I will talk to you. So you could reach out to me either way. And so with that, we're done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. This is Heather from the back of the room, inviting our live audience to ask questions. Kristen is going to bring you a microphone so that our audience on Zoom can hear those questions. And then we invite our Zoom audience to type their questions in the Q&A part of the webinar screen. Thanks.
Come on, y'all. Wasn't that good? It's got to be a question. There you go.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Paul. My question is, you're younger than me, but what are you seeing out of this new generation that seems so powerful, that is inspiring you or concerning you, or it's an open-ended question?
Wow, that's a good one. I think one is that they have less patience, which at times is good, right? And they're like, okay, this has been going on way too long and we're tired of waiting. Like we need to do this. So I think that's a plus. They are more comfortable, I think, at confronting power more directly and head on. Um, which I think is a plus too. I think sometimes the downside of that is not understanding how power works within systems and institutions, right? Because, the nuances and how these things get lined up. I think they're much more attuned to um, what they need in order to be productive. They're much better at work-life balance, right? I'll be honest, like I'm bad at work-life balance. Right. My wife will shake her head and go, yes, you're very bad at work-life balance, right? I think they're much better at that and understanding that their sanity, their health, and even what they invest in. There was just an article I was reading, I don't know, a couple weeks ago about home ownership and about young people who are like, well, the idea of putting all this time, money, sweat into a house versus taking care of myself, traveling, family, whatever, right? So that paradigm, I think, is a little bit shifted in terms of how they see, themselves and community, right? And so it's always refreshing at times to be in the room with them, right? Just because you need to get these different perspective, right? So I enjoy that, and after a little while, they figure out that a guy with a tie could be radical too.
Paul, I've got an anonymous person on Zoom who's saying, thank you for sharing your important work. What's the everyday person to do to reach urban housing equity?
Wow. Okay. The everyday person. Well, I think there's a bunch of ways to do that. You could volunteer in your local affordable housing provider, right? You figure out that you could make a contribution to your local affordable housing provider or community developer, because we always need money. Pay attention in your city to what is going on in terms of housing and development and urbanism, right? Get to know who's on your planning commission, get to know what's going on at your planning commission level. If you're so inclined, maybe you might want to be on your planning commission. I don't know. But I think, like I talk about, like, knowledge is power. So understanding what's going on and why, and like what your local politics are. And then, they're across the country, in every city, community, whatever, there are people working on affordable housing, urbanism, and they're happy to talk to you. They're happy if you have something you want to bring to them, and you can decide what that is, right? Everything from I'm going to volunteer if they have volunteer opportunities, to if I want to write a check, whatever I work for a company and I'm going to organize a volunteer day. Like, there's all kinds of things, right? I think there are lots of ways for you to be. So I think first, starting out by doing some research about what's out there so you can see what fits for you. And that doesn't have to be the other part of that. That doesn't have to be in housing or in development. I mean, if your passion is education, that's really important in our ecosystem of how cities operate. So also think about, well, what's your passion? What are you really interested in? Or maybe what you want to learn about, and look at it that way.
The examples you showed of the Bronx, where they started putting in a lot of big high rises and tearing down all the old buildings, is somewhat similar to what's happening in Madison. A lot of our urban neighborhoods are getting torn down for these big, high rises, and there's a need for new housing to, populate the downtown. What role does historic homes, the smaller places and things, contribute to social justice and equitable communities?
Wow. So I think we need a whole variety of types of housing, right? Not everyone, you know, wants to live in a high rise. Not everybody should live in a high rise. Um, when I talked about, the fire economy and how things work, what we see being built is what's the easiest thing to get developed, right? It's like, okay, this is what pencils the best most of the time, and it's the easiest way to do things. Um, I think in um, more traditional neighborhoods, whatever, having smaller homes, having those other options are really important, right? I mean, we don't have. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in America right now is we don't have starter homes. It's really hard for people to get into starter homes because there really aren't any, and they're not being built, and there's not work and um, ways to do starter homes. And having done a lot of affordable housing, I know why, because it's really hard, right? Right. But so we need to be pushing that. Is like, how do we do those starter homes? I think all of that scale is really important. Um, to be able to have that whole life cycle of housing, right? Because a lot of what we see being built is for a very specific demographic, right? Right. It's for a very specific demographic, and there's, the demographic is like this. We're seeing we're seeing a specific demographic. Um, so yes, really important to save those, to work on that, and to find ways in partnership with our folks who are doing other housing to figure out how to solve that problem. But yes, we should have that cross section. Um, in Minneapolis, we're a city of renters. We're 50% renters. Not something we talk about a lot. But we have, a huge stock of, single family houses and but we're losing a lot of these smaller, ramblers, cottages, et cetera, in redevelopment. Yes, and we did pass, zoning where single family housing is, um, not allowed in the city. Um, but we haven't had this big jump in duplexes and triplexes as a result of that. And that's because of the market and who does the work, not because of the zoning law. Right. And so we have to work more on, like, how do we get people to build more of those? Right.
I've got a couple of Zoom audience questions, if I may. One of them is, if you had a magic wand, what would you do first? Oh, maybe you've been asked this before. And the second is, what progress keeps you optimistic?
Okay, if I had a magic wand, what would I do first? Wow, that's really hard. There's so many of them. It's probably why it's hard. I'd change the banking system. Since the finance system is the driver, right? And if we can't get to changing how we finance, we're always going to be stuck, right? Because you guys all know, you can say whatever you want. If you can't get resources, it doesn't happen. So changing the finance system, to me, would be the big one. Really getting it to where it's much more equitable, and particularly it's much more equitable in how it views the places it will invest in, right? Because the biggest struggle is getting that finance system and having people going, well, really, we just don't think we're going to invest there. Right. Okay. What was the other one? Progress?
Yes. So what progress have you seen across equity issues that keeps you optimistic?
You know, 30 years ago, there was any of these projects I just showed you, no one was talking about, right? Like no one was saying that that people in neighborhoods could invest in commercial real estate or invest in ownership and make money. My wife and I tried to do a project like that about 20 years ago, trying to get people in a neighborhood in Minneapolis, we won't mention where it is, to think about this, and they were like, "You're crazy." And their basic thought was like, poor people shouldn't be investors because it's too risky, right? And there wasn't crowdfunding, and there wasn't a big change. And this is where change and the government comes in. There wasn't a big change in how investment works and being a qualified investor. Like there's a big shift in that, and that's why you can do things like um, Nico and the project in Portland, because now you can invest $10 and you don't have to go through this big deal with the federal government and the IRS to be able to do that, right? So that's huge progress. The other progress that we're having is I talk to people about this a lot all across the country, and more people are talking about why we need to think about this differently. In the professions I work in the architecture profession, the landscape architecture profession, I think urban planning, historic preservation, everyone is like, yes, we have to think differently about equity, people, space, and it's not just how we make it or how we save it, or right. And so I think all of those are really important in getting this to change. So that's progress that I see, and I'm a huge optimist. So
All right. First, I just got to say thank you for coming, because I was excited for this. I did happen to create a nonprofit that centers Black women around professional development, entrepreneurship, and financial health. I also serve as an alder on Madison's Common Council, representing District 17, which is the Far East side of Madison. I am an examples of models. I love to travel and just look at models that mostly interest me. And so here in Madison, you said something earlier in your talk where you mentioned, I believe you said the ecosystem around it didn't provide what was necessary for it to be successful. So in Madison, we had a project, I won't name it. Most people in the room could probably guess what it is. But the project failed really for that reason. And it was sort of like, oh, we learned our lesson. We're not going to do this again. But it was simply the resources weren't there. A lot of folks said they should be there. And now there's a lot of resistance from doing a similar project in Madison again. Not we're going to couple it with the resources so it works, but we're just not going to do it again. And then there are parts of our city, pockets, I'll say, that are very resistant to change. So for example, zoning laws, as a new alder, I think I came in right when we were changing the number of unrelated people who can live together from, I think, 3, and it was stressful to get it to 5. So we deal with that kind of tension here. Tension is great, but that's the kind of tension that we have. And so what I would love, if you have any examples for me, from someone who started a nonprofit who has now been learning development and interested more so in development now, I'm looking for more Black women-led or Black family-led development projects around both housing and commercial real estate.
So you should check out Ujamaa Place. I think that's in Boston. That's one that comes to mind right away. You should look at Third Space Action Lab. Oh, I cannot remember the woman's name that runs it. But anyway, Third Space Action Lab. It's run by a Black woman. She's bad. Not anymore, but Policy Link, Angela Glover Blackwell, who's now obviously the I think CEO emeritus or whatever. Who else? That could I think of? That would be I don't know, but I know you sent me a request on LinkedIn. Right. But if you send me your email, I will think deeper and respond to you with more. How's that? Those are two that hit me right away, and I may think of some more by the time we get out of here, but those are two that pop in my head.
Maybe talk without that. I live in a neighborhood in West Madison called the Highlands, which was platted in 1910. It has about 100 houses. Recently, the city wanted to change the zoning from 100 houses to 200 houses. The response of 90% of the residents was to put a restriction on their deed preventing the lot from being subdivided. As a result of this, the city of Madison backed off and are not allowing the zoning change. This is an area that has the original highway, no roads, no curb and gutter, no sidewalks. It's totally unique.
And the question is,
Commenting-
okay, yeah.
Commenting on how people can be.
Yeah, I mean, that's
be
about the
opposed-
power.
opposed to city development.
Yeah, that's about the power and agency, right? That there is enough power there to get the city to back off. And that's what we deal with all the time, right? Yeah, who has the power to get to make those changes? And I mean, it's politics, and politicians, they listen to their constituents about, being reelected. So it's hard to make those kind of changes, which are about bigger good, because, and there's studies on this, once you become a homeowner, you tend to worry more about, that whole thing about, is it going to impact my property, value? What? Yes, that's in the psyche, like that is proven, right? So it's hard to get to that, changes. So yeah, I hear you.
I've got one more question from a Zoom audience member here. Well, actually, I'm putting two together because they both have to do with stimulating affordable housing in the current housing environment. Any thoughts?
I'm gonna say this. There are a lot of people who do affordable housing across this country, a lot. And there is a robust affordable housing system and network, and there is money in it. I think the key, when we talk about affordable housing and you get local, you have to think about, well, what does that mean, right? Affordable to who, right? Like, what area median income are we talking about, right? How do we get down lower? Because an impact of all of the things about public housing is that the federal government is pretty much out of like doing affordable housing at like 30% AMI and lower, right? And nobody, at least I haven't found anybody, who can do that because you can't get enough subsidy. So that's a problem. But the truth is, there is affordable housing going on, being developed in this country. I think there needs to be a bigger discussion about how we talk about affordable housing, because there are a lot of people who are priced out of housing who maybe 10 years ago would not have had a problem, right? But if I'm making $15 an hour, working in the grocery store, and I'm like, I need housing and it needs to be affordable. And yeah, you're making $60,000 a year, but unfortunately you've got, because of how we finance college, $200,000 of college debt, right? And you need housing to be affordable. Those are two totally different things. And how we look at that. Now, what we don't have yet is we haven't found a way to say to people, you know what? If the $60,000 person can't get affordable housing and the $15 an hour person can't get affordable housing, like, nobody can. And if we can't come together, if we can't build a platform that says, yeah, right, housing needs to be affordable to this huge spectrum, and it should be a right, we're gonna have this us and them. right? We're going to have this us and them. And so, you know, in most places at home, we're doing affordable housing that's, you know, 60% AMI, right? In North Minneapolis, there's a ton of people who need housing at 30% AMI, and we cannot produce it because we cannot get enough money. And that's just the reality, right? And everything costs what it costs, right? We can't get around that. You know, land, buildings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm hoping is that we can find a way to build a movement and strategies that gets everybody like, yes, you know, more like, I think the environmental movement is moving that way. It's not perfect, but I think they're moving in this like, oh yeah, like everybody, because climate change affects everybody. Now it does affect people of color because of environmental racism, you know, at times worse than white people. But we can talk about climate change is a challenge for everybody. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't, like, if you, like, the earth is warming up, you can move over there, you can move over there. Yeah, right. It's still going to get you. We haven't figured that out in housing yet, how to build that coalition. And I think it's really important because then it gets us out of, well, it's for those people or it's for those people. And it gets us to, you know, it's for all people, right? And everybody needs a safe, affordable place to live. That was a long answer, but that's where I'm at.
Hi, yeah, this was a great presentation. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of it. And the intersectionality of all the different pieces between like spatial justice, housing policy, human connectedness, nature, all of those pieces. I'm involved in a project in Madison, and the thing I found the most difficult was working with the construction companies, working with finance, working with insurance, to get them to speak a language about like human connectedness, not just about building, housing, density, transportation, AMI, investment, but actually talking about how are we developing a neighborhood? How are we creating connections among people? And how does the physical environment foster that or take away from it? And how do we heal some of these injustices from the past through these projects? How have you seen any policy changes or any movement within like city government or state agencies that award tax credits to integrate in some sort of benchmarks around human connectedness and neighborhood development, not just energy efficiency benchmarks or investment benchmarks, but actually more about human capital?
Right. So that's a really good question. I agree with you. The reason I use Mariposa is because they have a ongoing plan and assessment that gets at those, right? But it's rare. I'm gonna say it's rare. You don't have a lot of that, and it's one, because it's really hard. It's hard, and it's time consuming and expensive to keep that data. Even though, I mean, I think you know, our city health departments and other places that are good at like getting that kind of information. One of the other things that I'm involved in is an initiative called Reimagining the Civic Commons, which is all about how do cities use public spaces, the public realm, civic assets, parks, libraries, neighborhoods, etc., to connect people and deal with isolation, segregation, etc. So it's like, how do we use these spaces to do that work? And we actually, if you go to civiccommons.com or just Google Reimagining the Civic Commons, there are some work around data and outcomes. But I think the other part of that is, and I think governments are trying, but it's really hard for them. I mean, it's really hard. And you know, construction insurance, like this is not a language that they are trained to speak, or right. So they don't get that. Even designers a lot, this is not right. This is not. So I think part of that is you have to help them, as we were talking about in the lobby, with that language, not just the language, but understanding. I think it's a bigger about understanding Because a lot of times they don't understand that these moves or these things that they see as this is how we work, this is the way it does, whatever, their bigger impact or their human impact. They're just like, well, this is how we do it. So part of it, I think, is like having to really help them see that. I can remember 20 years ago going to this conference in Minneapolis about land use and being in this small group and saying, well, how you're thinking about land is really impacting people, what they do, da, da, da. And everyone looking at me like, what are you talking about? Right. Now, I don't think we're there now, right? I think we've moved past that. But I know that it's not, we have to keep talking about it until it becomes just like no one would ever walk in the room and say, we're going to make a building without talking about the environment anymore. Right. But in the 70s, that wasn't the case. Right. Seal up the building, use the fossil fuels to heat, cool it, do whatever, and it's all good, right? But right, we've had this change, and now no, we don't do that, and everybody, says no, you have to think about this differently. I think it's up to us to do that work to keep talking about that. I am in the 2/3 of the way through this course with landscape architects and developers and designers in the Seattle area. About spatial justice. And it's all about, okay, introducing that, yes, you have to, and I'm always like, you're the spatial people. You have to understand, right? Like, how do you make these connections? And so it's that kind of work that we all have to do to help them get there. So you got to keep talking about it and keep talking about it and find the people who get it and who are willing to be the champions with you, right? Because it's an internal thing too, right? Because if I'm in insurance and I'm talking to other people in insurance and they're talking about this, they're gonna get it. And if you can, and I'm not gonna be crass, but a lot of people talk about, particularly buildings, about the environment, whatever, because it's a profit. Like, when people figured out too, like LEED could be about marketing, right? Like, yes, we've achieved all the LEED standards, but we didn't go all the way to take the test to get certified because that costs money. But we could say we're like that. So if there's a way to show that this is helpful to you and your bottom line, right? Blah, blah, like, yeah, that helps people, right? And I think we just have to be honest about that, right? Because everybody's busy, everybody works hard, everybody's got all kinds of things to do. And they're like, okay, if I have to do something more, right, I don't want to do that, right? So if there is something, can you get some of the major players to adopt it? Start talking to their folks about it. I think those are all ways to do that. And I think government is hard. Government is hard. Yeah.
You just mentioned the 1970s. I'll ask you a 1970s question. I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota during that time. And one of the places that was under discussion and development and of great interest was the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, which is right next to the West Bank of the University of Minnesota, sponsored by a very socially progressive woman named Gloria Siegel. They did, of course, remove the neighborhood and then put up the 2 high-rise buildings. But the idea was that it would be a new town in town. And I just wonder, from your perspective, have you looked at it at all? Did it succeed? Is it now maybe not a ghetto, but is it just serving students? Or is it integrated with the greater Minneapolis community?
So I know it well. Ralph Rapson was the architect. And yes, it was part of the new town in town program that the federal government sponsored, that we also got places like Columbia, Maryland, et cetera. Actually the plan was that there were going to be more of those towers that marched all the way to downtown Minneapolis, right? So no, all right. So no, in my opinion, it did not succeed in its bigger social goals in terms of connecting students, new town in town. And I also think just the idea that and I think this is at its time was like, yeah, well, buildings are what's going to make a new town in town and not about people and connections and right. Like that's what makes a community. Like, so now the interesting thing about that Cedar Riverside spot is it's 100% populated by Somali immigrants, East African immigrants. So that whole neighborhood is totally changed. The first time I went there, and as an architect, student, whatever, you see all these things, and right, and then you go there, right? And so when the first time I went there, what I was like, oh my God, this is so brutal and so depressing. It's got all of the trademark 1970, interior courtyards and like all those, spaces, and a lot of them had like chain link fences because stuff was happening. So all that to say is that no, it didn't achieve those. The East African community lives there. Let's totally transform that neighborhood. There are challenges there from poverty, struggles with Islamophobia, like all of those things, right? But in my view, in terms of its richness now, it's richer now, I think, in culture than it was before. And I think that's the ability of people, and Black people do this too all the time, to be like, okay, we're gonna take this thing that's not ours and make it ours, right? And we're gonna infuse it with this energy and culture and whatever. So I think there's that strength there, and there's that strength in the neighborhood that where they're occupying, the existing buildings that were there, the storefronts or whatever, but now they're this food, that food, this food. So for me, I think the lesson there is that to create this kind of like to enhance community, and even if you want to say new town in town, I think the challenge is that how do you work with community and that integration and that, and then whatever buildings you create has to support that, right? And so the history of the new town in town are pretty much, Columbia, Maryland is, now like, an upper middle class, a rich enclave. Jonathan is one. And then the real exciting one, if you want to read about that didn't work, is Soul City in North Carolina, which was Floyd McKissick's attempt to create this Black town in North Carolina. Great book. See, another book reference, but really an interesting project. Didn't work, failed for a bunch of reasons. Jesse Helms, racism, Nixon, but kind of a fascinating story about Newtown in town. Those buildings I don't think they'll ever come down. They're a marker on the skyline, you've got the color panels on them. Like, it's just, if you're an archie geek like me and you drive by there, you're like, yeah, I know what's going on there, right? But in terms of how that impacted people, I think it's a different story, but I don't think that's much different than architectural movements and buildings as the answer, as opposed to people, systems, community, culture as the answer, and then creating buildings, right? Because it's way easier to go, yeah, I'm going to build that over there. I'm going to make this. And all of that messy people stuff you don't really have to deal with. So, yeah. Thank you.